think we can start. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Catarina Duarte from the Air Center, and welcome to the Networking Fridays. Today we have a special session titled Architecture Follows Fish with architect André Tavares. This session will be moderated by a good friend, and I have to say, the person behind the concept and the idea of this Networking Fridays webinar, José Luiz Moutinho. So thank you both for accepting our invitation. And thank you to all the attendees. And José, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Catarina. I hope you can hear me well. I'm in the mountains in Santantown Island in Cabo Verde, but I couldn't miss this fantastic session here. And thank you, Catarina, for continuing the traditions of Networking Friday. This is fantastic. So today we have a very special guest that will take care of, a very interesting, subject. And I will start with some publicity of André Fish. Architecture Follow Fish. This is a wonderful book. I really, recommend you to read. And as an introduction, I read, some of the comments. This is a highly original exploration of the history of architecture in relation to fish, shedding light on the connection between marine environments and terrestrial landscape. I'm sure this will be a fantastic session. I will pass the floor right now to André. He'll introduce himself, and then he'll make his presentation. And please prepare your questions to be answered after the presentation. Thank you so much. The floor is yours, André.
Thank you, José and Catarina, and all the people that I don't know personally yet, but I see that there is a very nice attendance, and it's a pleasure. Well, I'm an architect. I'm in an architecture school, and I've been working for many years in theory and history of architecture. And for a while now, my focus shifted from the buildings themselves towards the fish as the main, let's say, definer of how we build. And that's what I will try to explain you in the next half an hour, hopefully in a clear fashion, so that we can understand how we can build an amphibious history of the North Atlantic. Amphibious meaning that it kind of relates lands and sea, terrestrial landscapes with marine ecosystems and in specific fish populations. What I'm presenting is mostly the research of this Architecture Follows Fish book that José so nicely commented just a few seconds ago. It has been recently published last November by MIT Press, and it's a book that synthesizes the hypotheses that we are now chasing and running and developing further in terms of research within a team in a European Research Council funded grant here in Porto, in Portugal. So the idea is that when we look to the landscape, when we look to the built environments, we have immediate relations with marine ecosystems, and relations that we often neglect, that we often don't see at first sight. And I like to use this historical image of Lisbon and a cod shop in Lisbon, where you can actually see three dried and salted cod. It's a 1960s, so mid-20th century picture. And you can see three dried and salted cods being sold. One Norwegian, costing 28 escudos, one national, meaning a Portuguese one, costing 26 escudos, and lastly, an Icelandic one, costing 30 escudos. So the most expensive, and of course the largest one. And probably for an attendance like you, I don't need to explain why a small fish or a smaller fish is a sign of overfishing. So obviously fishing increases the mortality rate of fish, and fish don't grow enough. And when we start to have smaller and smaller fish, we realize that's a sign of overfishing. And what we can actually see here is that the Portuguese fish being caught in the Newfoundland Grand Banks, the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, was already being overfished as a species when opposed to the Norwegian and the Icelandic cods. And it's this kind of relations, this connection between what we don't see in the urban landscape from the marine ecosystems that I'm trying to show. But the other thing that I would like to show and emphasize is that this ruin of the marine ecosystem, the fact that the fish population is somehow vanishing from the sea, has a backlash impact in the terrestrial landscapes. So this is the ruin of a drying facility for cod in Lisbon that was kind of developed and built in the 1940s and 50s and abandoned in the mid-70s, early 80s. And what we see is that there is a connection between the ruined marine ecosystem of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, at least for cod, with the urban landscapes around Lisbon. The second aspect is the idea of an architecture that is specific to fish. This building, this landscape, these poles that you see here, they only make sense for cod, for fish. And there are plenty of different landscapes that you can see in various areas of the North Atlantic that are unique for specific kinds of fish. And the cod dryers of Norway, for instance, of the Finnmark, here, Honisvag, Torfisk dryer, they are different from the ones that you've seen in Portugal. And there are a lot of architectural typologies that we can find that are related not necessarily to the societies or to the people that are building those buildings or those constructions, and they are even more related to the dynamics of fish populations and to how fish behaves within the ocean. So this is a late 19th century Georg Sars plan showing the movement of cods, the seasonal movements of cod for spawning from the Barents Sea here in the north, from Spitsbergen down to the Lofoten Islands, and to understand how this kind of pass that exists here in the Ega Ridge was key for the development of the cod fisheries in the Lofoten and Westeralen archipelagos. So if we follow different fishes, and this would be the case for a sardine architecture, we would find different kinds of buildings. These are stilt constructions over stilts in the shore of Portugal for sardine brineries. But we can also find more industrialized and very powerful building constructions, as the case of the Boston Fish Pier, built between 1914 and 17 in South Boston, and with a freezer, fishermen stalls, and then an auction market. And we can actually find new kinds of architectural types and new kinds of space and even new kinds of environments that are designed specifically for fish or for commodities. I particularly like this picture of a freezer in Boston, the Quincy Market Cold Storage, which was not only dedicated to fish, there was also dairies, meat, and other commodities. But here you can actually see the fish being frozen within this new environment. and you can actually see the halibut itself, or these poor beheaded fishes, but it marks a major shift that explains this connection between the marine ecosystem and the terrestrial landscape, and the architecture defines this point of passage, I would say, a local, a kind of a moment where the animal, the fish as an animal, is no longer an animal and becomes a commodity. And it's this precise moment where the fish becomes a commodity, where the animal becomes, enters into the market, that the architecture of the fisheries comes in. And the market dimension, how we eat the fish and how we trade the fish, becomes crucial for other kinds of types of buildings that we can find related to the fish trade. And this is the Billingsgate market in London. And you see here all the fishmongers. But what is interesting to look at London is that it became a very important fish consumption center, as well as Manchester, during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And that became possible through the development of a land network of railway system, which would expand literally the connectivity between the fishing harbors like Grimsby or Hull, in England, or in the south, Portsmouth, Brighton, Exeter, and other areas in England. But what I find interesting in this drawing that we managed to develop in our research project, bringing different sources together, is that while the city was expanding, the fishing grounds were also expanding, because the pressure upon the fish populations was also expanding. So here you would have the areas where fishermen were fishing in the beginning of the 19th century, here between the 1830s and the 1850s, between the 1850s and the 1870s, and between the 1870s and the 1890s. So what we actually see is, while the buildings and the infrastructure inland is expanding and it's growing, it's also increasing the fishing pressure upon the marine ecosystems. So there is this kind of dual relationship between the two sides of the story. And this is also possible because new different forms of consumption are brought into the market, and are, let's say, new ways of eating fish are designed to transform the culture and the consumption habits. And the most famous one would be the fish and chips, the classic, the fried fish and the deep fried fish, which basically is 19th century junk food. This is possible, and this happens while a key interface between land and sea transforms and develops. And this key interface are the fishing technologies. So from more coastal systems of fisheries, when coastal waters started to be depleted and ruined, to use the same term, other kinds of forms, stronger kinds of technology, usually more expensive with more technological investment, are designed to go catch more fish more far away, and increasing the catch per unit efforts, but also increasing the pressure upon fish ecosystems. And trawling comes into the story. So to make a bit of an outline of what I've been saying and what we are doing in terms of research and what is the research about. It's an history research. Maybe I didn't say this in the very beginning. I'm mostly working as an historian, and I'm looking to the North Atlantic together with a very nice team of researchers, and we are looking to this time frame that goes roughly from the mid 19th century or the first half of the 19th century till the first half of the 20th century and roughly to the 1970s, 1990s. The second thing is that we are looking to very specific species like tuna, cod, and sardines to kind of narrow down the scope and to look to very different kinds of fish within the trophic chain, within their bodily functions. And we are looking especially to these 5 critical layers, to the marine ecosystem. So how do these fish populations function in their days? How do they live somehow? Where are their habitats and why do we fish them there? So fishing technology, like the boats that I was showing you, and whenever we find changes in the fishing technology, we will find changes in the marine ecosystems. And the same happens in terms of food processing. And probably food processing is the key level of architectural transformation, in a sense that, imagine when we go from sardine brineries to canning factories, to canned sardines, this is a change of technology that transforms the buildings and also has a very different impact in the ecosystems, and requires a transformation of the fishing technology. Then there are politics, and politics are a game changer quite often, but the game changer that derives from food processing, fishing technology, and marine ecosystem. And finally, the consumption habits. As we eat, let's say, fish and chips, or frozen cods, or dried and salted cods, and so on and so forth. And we are doing this observation, moving around the North Atlantic and looking to, let's say, 7 case studies in different locations from Iceland, Norway, England, France, Portugal, US, and Newfoundland. So let me give you basically one example, which would be the topic of infrastructure, and then elucidate a little bit more, and then elucidate a bit more on the methodologies that we are using and trying to develop in terms of research. So this is a sardine, as I was telling, and it's becoming a commodity. It's losing its head. Oops. And one of the forms of fishing sardines are a small pelagic that we can actually, in sandy shores like the shore of Portugal, we can beach sign from the sardine, for the sardines. So we have these very unique kind of spectacular boats that go and surf the wave, literally, without a harbor, directly on the beach, and with animal power, the signs were pulled back towards shore and the fish would be processed. And this results in these very peculiar forms of architectures. I already showed one of these palheiros, built in wood. What I really like in this image is that you can actually see the difference between the very well crafted boat, the fishing technology, and you can, which is also wood, and you can see all the investments and the care placed in the fishing technology and the roughness of these, we can even call them shacks, built directly on the sand. And what I find more interesting, without infrastructure, without large public investment in, let's say, building a sewage system, a street, a road. You see that constructions are directly hanging in the sand. And this happens because these fishing settlements were extremely kind of loose and built upon the dunes with very short and very specific connections to the railway system and to the main distribution networks, through cutting through the dunes. I find this image quite telling, and it explains why these settlements can be dispersed along the coast and build a kind of a very small dotted sequence of very tiny nucleus, urban nucleus that spread on this sandy shore. And these settlements were designed for brining sardines, let's say for salted sardines, which were a low cost commodity. This is different from when the canning story comes into place. And canned sardines, unlike the brine sardines, were a high-end product. They were very expensive and they required more fishing pressure and thus a different kind of fishery. And here you can actually see a steam-powered seiner, purse seiner, fishing in the bay near Algarve, Portimão. And what these seiners required is that they could not operate from the shore, from these very low investment settlements, and they required large investments like these fishing harbors that you have, as this one in Leixões, north of Porto. And what is interesting, and you see all the public investment that was made to support this canning industry. And in Leixões, nearby Matosinhos, you still have the old city here, and you see the scale of the harbor in the 1940s, and all the canning factories that were built and operating in the 1940s. And you can see the scale of the operation overlapping the scale of the old city. And this transformation meant a huge transformation in the architecture itself. So there were no longer these small shacks, wood shacks that I was showing you, but there were these large industrial halls designed by architects with structural engineers and with a completely different scale of operation. And this scale of operation required a different kind of fishing pressure. So in terms of research, what we are trying to do is to connect with using architectural tools to represent what are the industrial and what are the architectures and the buildings related to these operations and how they function in relation to relation between the marine ecosystem and the terrestrial landscape. So here you have a purse seiner with a regular purse seine scale represented at the same scale of the building within its built context and with an average sardine school size in the Portuguese shore. So through this analysis, we are trying to understand how these kind of fishing facilities are being developed, how these point of passages are being designed. And this would be the Lorient case, which is, as I show you, it's a design by an architect. And you actually see here the fishing harbor functioning with an auction market connected to the railway system, with a freezer, and with a coal pier to supply coal to the fishing boats that you see all aligned here on this side. So it's this kind of dynamics that we are trying to trace and to identify in history, because it's in these points of passage that we can find the landings that tell us what kind of fishing pressure these buildings were making in the marine ecosystems. So quite often, these architectures are extremely regulated, and in archives, we can find out how many fish these locations were processing and these buildings were actually transforming. And through this, we can have an overview of the impact of these architectures. So the last aspect of my presentation, and to go towards a conclusion, is that as architects, as architectural historians, we are mostly looking into fish. And we are trying to persuade biologists to work with us to look to the fish, understanding which kinds of fish qualities generate different architectural qualities. And that goes for the full life cycle of the fish, and trying to understand how fish behaves as a larvae, as an embryo, as a juvenile, an adult, and so on and so forth. And this gives us that this can give us an idea of the life cycle and which space, which areas of the ocean the fish is occupying in their different times of their life. So here you see a map of Iceland and how the spawning grounds, and you can see the areas that we were trying to identify the specific spawning areas or the ideal spawning areas, how they would spawn, especially in the southern areas of Iceland, then move to feeding grounds in the northern sides of Iceland through the life cycle of a cod. And that actually, through this analysis, we can explain some urban patterns of cod urbanization in Iceland. This means that as architects, we are required to work and to operate with different systems of representations when compared to, let's say, the plan section elevation of what is the conventional architectural representation systems. Because, as you know, ecosystems are dynamic, and architects are trained to represent fixed sets for fixed buildings in specific locations in a given moment of time. So we are experimenting with more dynamic systems of representation, let's say, to understand the water temperature. That would explain a lot of population distribution patterns for the fish, and therefore to understand the dynamics of urban representations, but also how the fishing vessels behave. And this is an analysis of trawling, present day trawlers, fishing routes in Iceland. And they actually, if we monitor where the trawlers are trawling, we can actually understand the huge pressure that is being put in the Halley fishing grounds in the Straits of Denmark, which also explains why the northwest peninsula of Iceland is so much preferred to the urban development related to cod fisheries nowadays. As researchers, we are also working with the fishermen themselves and using, I wouldn't call them ethnographic methods, but almost, but especially learning through fishermen and with fishermen. This is José Pereira, how they fish, to understand a different kind of sources that are not scientific sources, but are way more related to the fish and the environment. Another kind of sources, quite hard and quite often very enigmatic, are archival sources. And this is a logbook of a cod fishing boat in 1916 Iceland. So that we can actually know in each day of the month where the fisherman was fishing in 1916 and how much he was fishing on that given period. And we are using GIS systems and geographic information systems to cross-reference these multiple data. So data coming from biological, or let's say these large areas that you can see here come from an analysis of sardine spawning grounds in the south of Brittany, or the location of the Brittany main fishing centers, or these green dots and these lines that you see here are some experimental fishing routes in 1887, when sardines were collapsing and when the sardine fish population was collapsing in Brittany. So we cross and we weave these multiple sources together to understand the dynamics of the urbanization. So for instance, here we can see three different moments of Ilhavo, which is a fishing harbor in Portugal dedicated for cod fisheries that was expanding in the 1940s and in the 1950s. And that would tell us a bit about the cod practice or the cod story in Portugal. And then we can't avoid being architects, so we go for designing the buildings and designing the multiple typologies and the multiple forms that are being built specifically throughout history to understand how a fishmonger shelter is different from a lighthouse, is different from a cannery, and how canneries transformed throughout time and how different they were from cold storages. And actually, in this pair of drawings, you can understand how different is a brinery and how different is the scale of a building in the mid-19th century from the scale of a building in the early 20th century. And it's not necessarily a matter of square meters in footprint, but also a matter of building scale, literally. And that shows how, and that gives a hint how much fishing pressure a concrete structure was producing as opposed to a stone masonry wall structure. And quite often comparing these buildings, this is Iceland, this is in Ísafjörður, comparing the scale of the buildings with the scale of the boats and going throughout time understanding the differences in scales. And of course, this can be done using the fish landings as connectors between what happens in the marine ecosystems and terrestrial landscapes. So with marine biologists, we are also working with habitat suitability models, trying to understand how these dynamics operate throughout the North Atlantic. So this is a hindcast model for 1960, which will allow us to overlap logbooks and fishing routes for cod that we have for the 1960s, and to relate the observations of the fishermen with the habitat suitability conditions and the dynamics of what's happening inland. So to conclude, basically the idea of the research is to build an architectural history, or to write an architectural history that is written not from a human perspective, but through the fish-eye view. Is there an architectural history that we can write and that we can understand from the fish perspective? Thank you.
Thank you so much, André. Wonderful presentation. Really, really interesting. If you could stop,
Yes, I will.
Okay, good, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, so much. We have two questions here, but first, thank you so much for a very nice presentation, which is for me twice interesting because I've been working with the ocean, and in the last 7-8 years, and I've been an architect for quite a while now. So, I have two questions, but I'll start with one from Jerry Miller, our good friend Jerry Miller. He asks, most of your examples are from the Atlantic. Have you looked at the Far East, where the architecture generally has a different flavor, or for instance, at Africa, where artisanal fishing is important?
Well, we've been focusing in the North Atlantic because it's large enough. And it's already hard to deal with it. We looked a bit to Africa because there were many European fisheries harvesting and going towards Africa and placing a large fishing pressure up there. And we noticed that indeed there are differences and there are very strong operations happening. The fishes are different, and the dynamics, let's say, the exploitation is also different. So, to be honest, we didn't look that much, and I am not very aware of research being done and being conducted from an architectural perspective in those areas, or in any area, to be more honest. But I'm sure there will be different. The processes will be different. The buildings will be different. But some things start to reveal more patterns and more similarities of what's going on. So I haven't looked, and I haven't many examples to show, to be quite frank.
So thank you for your response. I hope, Jerry satisfied with the response. So actually, you open a new area for study, applying your ideas in other areas in the world. This could be very interesting. And I have two more questions here from the audience, but continuing your answer, there is books about form follows function, very famous book in architecture. We have form follows weather, and now form follows fish. How do you think, in building on top of Jerry Miller's question, how do you include local culture, aesthetics, materials, and local practices in your research?
Yeah. Well, I think it's inevitable that architects look to form, because that's, as an architect, that's what we do in the end. We basically do synthesis. We synthesize things that come from many areas, and we bring them together into a form that that kind of solves or tries to solve conflicts. It then generates new conflicts, but synthesizes multiple tensions, multiple ideas. So form, usually it's the consequence, it's the result of a variety of factors that, as architects, we push towards a synthesis. So what we are trying to do is to understand how much environmental or non-human factors are implied in the design of built forms. And when you mention, and going again with this variety of local cultures that exists, I think there is one very curious aspect that we are understanding within the North Atlantic, is that we see what we call vernacular architecture in Portugal, for instance, and it has exactly the same forms of what it's called vernacular architecture in the Americas. So probably it's not so vernacular because it doesn't belong to the place, and eventually it might belong to the cultures, but probably it belongs more to the fish themselves than the genius loci, to use a very dear definition for architects. This idea that the place, the construction stems from the loci, the place. There is a god in the place that generates the building. So the building's born naturally out of the ground, which is not true. They are designed. All of these things are designed by people. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting answer. And I do agree. Sometimes we always say that this architecture comes from the ground, and actually there is, a whole process behind it. Materials and the whole history behind all that. So now we go through Alejandro Acosta's question. First, he says that excellent presentation. And he asked something similar as Jerry just asked. Has anyone conducted a similar study in the Caribbean or Latin America that examines the impact of European fishing nations on coastal development in these countries? Specifically, are there studies that analyze how foreign fishing activities have influenced local economies, marine resource management, and community livelihoods? Great question.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, because as I said, I've been focusing in the North Atlantic, and there is a beautiful book by Alexander Pope on the colonial enterprise of cod fisheries in the 16th, 17th century in Newfoundland, North Atlantic. And it's clearly a colonial process, to the extermination of the Beothuk, who were the natives, inhabitants of Newfoundland. I know that there are studies looking to the whaling industries in Brazil, for instance. But I don't know them that well. And to be honest, I'm not finding that often similar approaches. I think from the architecture perspective, there are not many because I think for a reason of training. We are trying to look at the buildings, and architectural history is an history that's very much focused or derives from art history, or eventually sociology. So it's very seldom that you find someone looking to the fish. So what you would find, and I think that you can find a lot in the US, and I'm sure if we go to the Caribbean or South America, we'll find it as well, is this idea of vernacular architecture and how specific communities of fishermen were developing some kinds of buildings, some kinds of constructions that are related to a very specific activity. But the effort that we are doing is kind of overcome that local, very often limited in geography and especially limited to land history towards an Atlantic history or a marine ecosystem history, so that we can actually better understand how much of land is the result of the ocean. So again, to be very direct to the answer, directly answering, I'm not so much aware. I think most of the studies there that exist are very specific and very focused on land. And on the other side, they are, as you say in the question, they are extremely focused on marine resource management, which only look to the ocean. Very seldom they look to the impact of that management inland. And they are totally focused in the ocean and not connecting the ocean to land.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer. And we have one more question from Bolaruina Balogun. I hope you pronounced your name well. So thank you, André, for the exciting study. Architecture follows fish. Very interesting. Within the region and time scale of your study, were there other economic activities besides fishing that also dictated architectural development?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question as well. For instance, in these settlements that I showed that were built for the sardine extraction along the shore, in this sandy shore, is the kind of image. Let me quickly share the screen again and try to go back to this image. Oh, where is she? Okay, here. So you have nothing. It's the desert. No? The dunes. There are some populations there. So the sardine dynamics created this point of access. What happens next is that you start to have tourism and villagiatura, how do you say, summer resorts. No, you start to have people going to have sea baths, and you start to have a completely different economic activity running alongside the fishing activity. And when the fishing activity disappeared in the 1960s, these places have become touristic destinations. And the urban development happened because of the fisheries, but then within a completely different economic activity. And there is even a very interesting aspect, is that throughout the shore, the dominant winds are northbound. So you have a very strong north wind. So you have the fishing community in the south of the touristic village. So it's very interesting, this kind of dynamics. The other story that I wanted to present is this one, the harbor. The harbor was not built for fisheries. The harbor was built to commercial trade and, let's say, the textile industry and the port wine industry around Porto. But then it was the fishing industry that benefited from the existence of the harbor and of the investment that was made. So this to say, it's quite rare that these dynamics are pure. Let's say it this way. It's quite seldom only fishing. Usually things are more complicated inland than just the fish. I hope I replied
Thank you,
answered the question.
yes, thank you, André. I have a question for you. Can you stop sharing?
Yes, yes,
so people can
Sorry.
see you. So
I don't know. Sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, good, perfect. Thank you so much. So I have a question for you. I mean, you know, you've been talking about kind of a photographs, like stills in time that we compared. But we are living now in the dynamics of climate change. And I have a specific question related to the climate change, that we are now having what is called the tropicalization of temperate ocean waters, where the tropical fishes are displacing the temperate fish in a very short scale, which is not compatible with infrastructure development, with buildings. How do you factor in everything related to these completely new, fishes that are coming to certain areas? And how do you think it will be the future of this architecture that is, as you said, is very much focused on one or two types of fishes?
Yeah. Well, we are doing, the research is mainly historical, in a sense that we are looking to a specific period of time, and there are two key changes, or there are many more, but there are a few key changes in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s that kind of close a very specific historical period. One is freezing, which allows a displacement or a disconnection between the processing and the harvesting that is larger than what existed before. The second one is the law of the oceans, which also transformed a lot all these dynamics. And the globalization of markets and trades, that, let's say, a fish is caught in Norway, then is flew to China to be processed in China, and then is flew back to Brazil to be sold in Brazil. So you have a completely different planetary dynamics of the fish trade. And last but not least, you have aquaculture and or fish farming, which introduced again a very different form of fishing architecture, we may say, in the late 20th century and in the beginning of the 21st. So these processes that I'm telling, they actually are relatively limited on time. When fisheries are no longer subsistence fisheries, they become industrial fisheries. This starts in the 15th century with the cod fisheries, with the British cod fisheries especially, but gains a completely different scale in the 19th century after the 1830s. So this to explain that we are looking into history and not to the present or the future. So when you ask me about climate change, the first thing to understand the habitat suitability models that we are using in terms of biological modeling and population modeling and habitat modeling, it's climate, it's temperature, winds, the chlorophyll, and it's all related to the oceanic conditions, to the environmental conditions. And it's obvious that it has a gigantic impact in history. If we do the hindcasts, we can realize how much it had an impact. So how do I see the future? Oops. I'm on the pessimistic side of the story. That's why I haven't become an architect, in the sense I'm not designing, because architects usually are very optimistic. No, they have to be, otherwise it's a dead end as a profession. So that's maybe, so I see overfishing happening everywhere, and we see it happening historically, and everybody since the 18th century saying, there is overfishing happening, there is overfishing happening, and then it grows, it grows, it grows. So the climate is changing, habits will change, architecture will change, the world will change. Let's hope for the best.
Oh, yes. So, but in a final note, you still have to add on all these coastal constructions that you presented. I mean, the effects of storm surges, I mean, that are affecting coastal erosion, is, sea level rise. So there is a lot of new areas for architects, to incorporate in their design.
Yeah. But my expectation with this research, and now I'm being optimistic, and to close with an optimistic tone, is that architects and public decision makers and so on and so forth, they can look to lands with a stronger awareness of the marine ecosystems and of the ocean dynamics, which is something that doesn't happen.
Oh, this is a very nice closing phrase. We are very close to time. So if there is anybody, if there is any questions, I mean, if not, I will close the session. Thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful presentation, André. Really, really fantastic.
Thank you so much for attending. It was a great pleasure.
So, Catarina, back to you, Catarina, if you want to say a few words before.
Thank you both again. Thank you to the attendees. Thank you for the questions, and see you in next Networking Fridays. Bye.